Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Hello. Did this demo actually take place? Thousands of anti-Brexit protesters staged demonstrations across the UK last weekend. But if you weren't there, would you know about them? Some feedback listeners say there was precious little BBC coverage of the marches, and they smell a rat.
How many thousands of Brexit demonstrators are required for the BBC to consider it newsworthy?
Later in feedback, we'll try and get the answer from the BBC's UK news editor. But first, if you want to influence the public debate, get walking. The March for Our Lives in Washington. An estimated 500,000 people descended on the US Capitol, calling for stricter gun control. The march dominated much of last Saturday's BBC News output. You could not miss it. But there were other marches going on, of which you may well be unaware, unless you were glued to social media. Thousands were also demonstrating in the UK, in a series of anti-Brexit marches in Leeds, Edinburgh and Pontypridd, among other places, and a flood of people emailed feedback@bbc.co.uk to express their suspicion that a deliberate blackout of anti-Brexit protests had been imposed.
My name is Lloyd Dawes and I am from West Molesey in Surrey. The BBC appears to have in place a news blackout on anti-Brexit marches. The BBC covered the anti-gun protests in the United States and Nigel Farage throwing some fish into the Thames. But there is barely a dicky bird on the many thousands who took to the streets across the United Kingdom on Saturday to campaign for continued EU membership and a referendum on the final deal. How many thousands of Brexit demonstrators are required for the BBC to consider it newsworthy?
My name's Charlotte Swift. I'm from Britain but living in France. I was pretty disgusted because they almost didn't handle it at all. There were a number of marches last Saturday, and particularly in Leeds was a very large march, reported to be 8,000 to 10,000 people. BBC reported it as several hundred. Clearly, the BBC are not reporting the strength of feeling for Remain in the UK.
My name is Paul Unwin and I'm from London. I saw no reflection of the marches on the BBC, setting that in comparison to Mr. Farage's performance chucking fish off a boat in the Thames, which seemed to get a lot of coverage. I felt that the BBC was failing in its duty of balance.
Some strongly held views, not only about the lack of coverage of those anti-Brexit marches, but also about the BBC's overall treatment of Brexit. Concerns that I put to Richard Burgess, the BBC's UK news editor. I began by asking how substantial had been the national coverage of those marches.
Well, we covered them on the website. The local news, Look North, also covered them. I think it was their second story. But I do think we need to continually look at this issue and make sure that we are alive to these marches that are happening, whether they're in London or outside of London, monitor them and then try and make an assessment based on a number of different factors over what level of coverage they can get. It's worth remembering.
So just on that, what assessment, was it then you made that these were not worth reporting on the national news?
Well, I don't think the figures of people there were enormous. They were in the hundreds or thousands. They're always quite difficult to absolutely assess how many. When we're making an assessment on whether we're going to cover a protest like this, it's influenced by a number of factors. You know, how much of a live issue is it? How much of a developing issue is it? Is this march likely to bring about significant change? Has it been kind of influenced by very recent events? Is there a real developing news story around this march? I mean, we have reflected Brexit and the various opinions around Brexit, pro and anti, significantly within our output, and we're continuing to do that, and we're doing it this week, obviously, with the 1 year till the exit. So,
well, you see, you're challenged by a number of our listeners. One, Charlotte Swift clearly thinks you underestimated the numbers. She said there were thousands. Where did you get your figures of hundreds from? Where do you get your figures from?
So I think you get them from a variety of sources. They're quite difficult. I don't think anybody knows exactly how many people are on these marches. So they can be from the police, they can be from the organisers. We had a reporter on the ground there as well in Leeds who contributed to our understanding. But can we say exactly how many people are on any one march? I don't think you can. I think inevitably people are making estimates based on their level of understanding.
Well, you covered very considerable coverage over that weekend to the gun control marches in the United States. Obviously important. But, as some listeners have pointed out, not of direct relevance to the UK, whereas Brexit undoubtedly is.
Well, specifically on the US marches, I do think that is exactly what I'm talking about. A developing story, an extraordinary march of hundreds of thousands of young people, emotional speeches after a significant event recently, the Parkland High School shooting, and the potential of a change in the way America views their gun laws. So,
but does that compare with our own future? The biggest change for 50 years, people demonstrating passionately about their belief this is the greatest foreign policy mistake in 50 years, and you don't give it the prominence you give to what we assume is demonstrations which will marginally affect whether America have gun laws or not.
So two things. We definitely have given expression to those views around Brexit and the EU marches. And I think what I want to say is that I do think this is something that we do need to look at, we need to be alive to, and I think I want it to be on our agenda to assess.
But hasn't it always been on your agenda? This is what
absolutely.
People find strange. You don't say, are you hinting that actually, although you won't say it, you made a mistake in this case, you should have
No, I would tell you.
You look at it again. No, you didn't. You're adamant.
I don't think so. I suppose what I'm trying to get across is they're not simple decisions. I don't think you can say, well, if the march reaches this number of people on it, we will definitely cover it. I think there are a number of factors to take into account. I want us to be alive to that, to monitor them, because, I'm aware of the level of feedback that you've had on this.
Finally, let me deal with the question of bias. Some would say in the first instance, you just made the wrong decision. OK, that sometimes happens. But some think, actually, you made this decision because you're biased. They would say, look, you covered Nigel Farage and a handful of people throwing dead fish into the Thames last week, a clear stunt. And he didn't cover these marches. Pro-Brexit.
I don't think we did cover that, the Nigel Farage thing much, by the way. It wasn't on the 6 or 10 o'clock news. I mean, we might have done a little bit of marginal coverage. I think that actually does reinforce what I was saying. There's a specific issue that's developed since the transition deal was agreed around the common fisheries policy. It did give us an opportunity to get into that issue, which is of quite a lot of concern to, in particular, Scottish Conservative MPs.
But the final thing, I suppose, is that people would say you are so aware of how divisive this issue is that the BBC simply wants to get through the next 12 months unscathed.
I don't think you could claim that we're stepping back from covering Brexit. You just look at the amount of coverage we have given to that topic this week, with 1 year to go until the official kind of leave. I think what we want to do is to try and explain the different viewpoints, but also how it's going to influence life across the UK. So it isn't just about reporting marches and protests, it's about trying to explain Brexit and what's happening and what the implications will be.
Our thanks to Richard Burgess, the BBC's UK news editor. And given the number of tweets and emails we've already received on the most contentious subject of our time, I probably don't need to remind most of you that later in the series we're going to be looking in depth at the BBC's coverage of Brexit, not only in its news journalism, but also in its general radio programmes, its drama and even its comedy. Can't wait.